How's that sound? Can you give me a text arrow if that's coming through? Sorry about that. Nothing like talking to yourself. Testing, testing, testing. Can you hear me now? Let's see. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing, testing, 1, 2. Okay, sounds like we've got it. Okay, well, that's what happens. The great thing about live is stuff like this is crazy and it's going to happen, and I apologize for that. So um, let's start from the top. So thanks for being here on this beautiful spring night. I hope your spring has been going well wherever you're at in North America, the Northern Hemisphere. And I wanted to talk tonight about portrait preparation. I have a student, or I have a member of this community who's got a portrait that's coming up that he really wants to deliver the goods. And he's primarily a landscape and a wildlife photographer, so that's a little bit out of his comfort zone. But before I get into that topic, let's talk a little bit about the other two topics that were on the list. One was a wedding walkthrough, a preparation from beginning to end. And while I'd love to go through that all tonight, I think it'd be a little bit tricky to try to get that all into the session. I will do a live stream on that because this year is a special year for me. It's a new year because of all the new gear. And so much has changed even since last fall. The A1 is here, the A7S3 is here. Those were not there when I was doing weddings, both stills and video last year. So I'm really excited to how I'm going to incorporate those into the mix this year. And they will change the game in terms of how I think about approaching the work that I'm doing. And so I really want to give it a fair shake to go from beginning to end, talking about the preparation that one does just going into the week of a wedding. What do you do on the Thursday or Friday before the wedding? What gear do you bring? What kind of backup gear do you bring? And just to give you a little bit of a hint, I have kind of what I call the Noah Ark strategy, which is 2 of everything. So that's one of the things that is just really, excuse me just a second. It's one of the things that I think is really important for photographers to have 2 of everything, especially at weddings. Weddings are an event that cannot be reproduced. It can't be redone. And that's why you have to be ready for everything with lenses, with bodies, with strobes. And so we will go into detail about that. And now what will I bring, given that this year is a new year for cameras, for stills, and now cameras for video. So that leads me to topic 1, which was the A1 and the FX-3. These are 2 cameras that came out in the early part of this year. The A1 is something that a lot of folks expected, although the specs when they came out were off the charts. 50 megapixels, up to 30 frames per second, a new processor, just new algorithms for autofocus, just an amazing camera, and it also includes 8K video. And so that is something that is the first in any Sony camera, that is to say 8K, but it also has the great video codecs of the A7S3, which has been considered like the premier mirrorless camera, video camera. In fact, Philip Bloom gave it his video camera of the year for 2020, and it's really not a video camera per se, But that leads me to the FX-3, which came out maybe 6 weeks ago, I think it was. And it came out as kind of such a surprise. I know I was very surprised. Sony kind of quietly snuck this into their lineup. And it kind of took a little bit of the size of the A7C and made it a video-centric unit that's built around the guts of an A7S III, which has probably the most insane video in a $3,500 camera that's out there, as well as really fine stills and incredible high ISO performance. Those are the three things that make that camera so really amazing. Now, as a wedding photographer, I've used the A9 and the A9 II, and one of the main reasons is because the silent shutter is so accurate, so quiet, and there's no mirror blackout. And with the processors of those cameras and now the A1, you don't have to worry about rolling shutter. You don't have to worry about if you pan, you might create some kind of artifact or a kind of an elongated person as you might in other cameras. The A1 is the best processor to date and should give the best performance as a silent shooting camera, not only for sports, but for other things too. And so one of the other things that I'm really intrigued about is the fact that it has an anti-flicker filter in silent shooting. Before, we've only had it in the mechanical modes, and that's been great, but it's now super nice to have that in silent shooting mode. And also, there's a way to sync flash now in silent shooting. So this gives us the capabilities, possibly with the right flash, at the right power settings, of doing up to 30 frames per second with a flash and camera. That's pretty insane. Now the shutter, mechanical shutter, is 10 frames a second, and Sony managed to somehow make that sync at a speed of 1/400th of a second, which is about a stop faster, which means that on a bright sunny day, you need less power from your flash to balance out or fill as you would with earlier cameras. So as much as I love the A9 II, the A1 is my new go-to camera, even though the files are probably a little bit bigger than I would like for a wedding, but I'm willing to deal with that because the features in the camera, the enhanced improvements in eye autofocus, tracking autofocus in video, the addition of cinema profiles when I shoot video, as well as the great video codecs that the A7S III has, which we now have on the A1, all of that makes it really, really important to me to have this camera. So the second camera I'll have it for weddings is an A7S III, which may seem like an odd choice, but because of the high ISO capabilities and the fact that I shoot a lot with zooms and therefore don't crop a lot, having a 12 megapixel file is not a big deal for me. I've got a 40x60 print over on the studio wall that was made with a 2005 12 megapixel Canon 5D, the original one. And if you res it up in 10% increments, it took that file and made it an incredible 40x60. So I have no worries that the quality of the Sony sensor, which is light years ahead of that previous sensor from Canon, which was great in its day, but now it's so much better, and you've got high ISO performance that will allow you to basically see in the dark. So it changes the way that you actually think about shooting receptions, because now you can actually shoot almost available light or with very, very low powered flash or even LED lights. So all of this has really kind of changed the game. It's not the same wedding photography that maybe you did back in 2009, because now we've got tools that allow us to kind of basically capture anything that we shoot. Anything that we see, we can really capture and make a great image. And that's, I think, one of the great things about the Sony system. Now, of course, people are going to say, well, you're a homer. You are somebody who loves Sony and you're sponsored by them. Therefore, you are obviously in the tank for them. And I will admit, I am totally, totally in love with this system. And I have been since 2014. And it's only gotten better. See, I've been shooting cameras since probably the 70s, and I've shot all kinds of cameras, from mechanical cameras, rangefinder cameras, DSLRs, SLRs, medium format view cameras, everything. And the thing is it's just like, these are the cameras that I've wanted for my entire career, but I didn't even know that I wanted them because They allow me to do everything from stills to high quality video. And they do it in a form factor that's really, really small relative to what other systems are. So yes, I am totally on the Sony team. There's no two ways about that. But I encourage folks who might be shooting other brands to just try these cameras. Reach out to me or Sony Pro Support folks because they might be able to help. I know I've helped people get loaners to try because it's so important for you to put these cameras in your hand because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know until you get the cameras. So the A1, and that's going to be my main go-to for stills, especially for portraits, but also for the documentary events during the day. And one of the nice things is with a 50 megapixel sensor, I can shoot JPEGs that are incredibly high quality and scale them down to 21 to half size, and they will still be great. I have been shooting more and more JPEGs over the last 6 months, and I find that the quality, the dynamic range, even in those JPEGs, is superb. The other thing is you also can crop into APS-C. And so what that means is it gives you an extra 1.5 times crop on some of your camera lenses, which could be very helpful with telephotos. But it also gives you the chance to shoot RAW files that are smaller than the full-size 50 megapixel RAW files. I also shoot compressed RAW, so they're not quite as heavy, not quite as deep or as rich as your basic uncompressed files that that you can also shoot with the cameras. There's also the addition of the HEIF format, which is a 10-bit file that's smaller than JPEG. I haven't really played with it yet. It seems like it's kind of in the early stages in kind of the adoption and development, even though it's been in phones and iPhones and Samsung phones for a long time. I think it's been with Samsung. I know it's been with Apple. And so therefore it's excuse me, it's going to be one of those things that I'm really excited to check out. So back to the FX-3, which came out a little bit ago, and a lot of people looked at it. In fact, when I saw it on YouTube, I was watching tons of reviews, and there seemed to be two camps. There was either the love it, totally love it, or the ones who totally didn't get it and kind of hated it, really. And there was very little in between. So I was intrigued by this camera because of the shape, the form factor, and that it was geared towards doing cinema. I thought that was pretty cool for a camera in that price range. But the other thing that intrigued me was the kind of the reaction from people, that there was very little middle ground. It was really love or hate, or at least that's what I kind of registered. There was kind of a lot of whatever, and a lot of people think from the production world, I suppose, because I'm not from that world, so I can't really speak for them, but it seemed like a lot of the people in the production world that have been using bigger cameras like Reds and Venices and FX-6s and FX-9s and things like that are kind of looking at it as like kind of a toy camera. And I'm coming from it from the other side, from the still side, and I see it as a camera that could be really useful as I expand more and more into video. And so I got the camera to test, and at first I must admit I was really disappointed. I was like confused by it. I think it had some presets changed, and I really didn't kind of know kind of the lay of the land, and it reminded me of what happened when I first rented the A7 in 2013. I rented that camera. I was one of the first people to rent it in December of 2013. Got it from Lens Rentals, and I was so excited. But then I started going through it, and I was like, well, this isn't really like my Canons. And of course it's not, because it had a lot of different zones, and it had a different kind of menu structure. I really didn't understand it. So I called a friend at Sony, and he kind of walked me through it, and he kind of gave me the lay of the land about this camera. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go back and I'll give it a try, and I'm really going to try to make it work. And so what I did was I reset the camera back to the factory defaults, because this is a camera that's dedicated to video first, still second, whereas A9 II, A1, A7S III, they come out of the box ready for stills. Even though they can shoot awesome video, they're really tweaked for still photographers. This one's really tweaked for cinematographers. And there's basically two cameras. There's the camera that works when you're shooting video, and your controls are all on that right-hand quadrant, including the joystick on the top deck. And the menu is over on the right side, not the left side. That's the mode dial, because there's no PSAM dial on the top of the camera. So the mode is on the left side of the camera, but the menu is on the right side. And that threw me at first because the menu is on the left side for the A9 II, the A7S III, and all of these cameras that I've been used to. And I thought, well, why would they do that? That just kind of throws it off. But then I sat down and I tried to get in the mindset of the person that designed this camera and how they intended for it based on the default settings and the function menu settings. And then it started to make sense to me. And then I started to really get excited about the camera. And then I started to see things that I could do with it from the standpoint of the form factor, the grip, the lower angle that it tends to work at, the lack of EV, which in some ways can help, but I know it hurts some folks too. But it's really a camera that I think has a lot of potential for a hybrid shooter such as myself. So I know that when I am going into something for video, that's going to be my go-to. It really is. And I didn't want to send it back. And I have done a video, I've recorded a video of my menu walkthroughs and kind of my thoughts about that camera. And I'll be doing that for next week. So it's the kind of thing that I want people to have a look at because I think it gives it a different perspective on that camera, very different hopefully from what other folks have, how they've come at it. I come at it from the standpoint of is primarily a still guy, but who's doing more and more video and wants to do more and more video. And so therefore, this camera is really going to fit well into that. The fact that I can do tracking autofocus, touch tracking just like the A7S III, the fact that it feels in a lot of ways like the same files from the A7S III, that I can use Cinetone, Cinetone PP11. In fact, it was there before it was even in the A7S III, which came about a week after that camera was released. So that's the kind of thing that now the A1, the A7S III, and the FX-3 all have that Cinetone PP11, which means that my files are going to look even more consistent from camera to camera. And the tracking autofocus in video, that's a big deal. And every camera that I have now, with the exception of the RX10 Mark IV, which I still love, but it doesn't have eye autofocus video tracking like the A7S III or the FX-3 does. These are the cameras that have this technology. Now, some folks may say, well, the A1 is a pricey camera, and that it is, and the A7S III is fairly expensive as well too. But one of the things that Sony does is they keep relevant their older cameras by upgrading firmware. And they also upgraded hardware, which is something I had never seen. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Sony quietly came out with the A7R3A and the A7R4A. And what they did is they increased the resolution of the rear screen. They included a lot more advancements in the autofocus. They really boosted the quality of that A7R3 with the A7R3A. The A7R3 is a heck of a camera. In fact, it might be the best value camera in the lineup if you need a high resolution camera but you don't need the most current features. But now it's going to be even better because of the advancement or the addition of the A7R3A designation. I don't know how much it's going to cost. I don't know when it's going to be available, but it's a camera that I think a lot of folks will really, really like. And I'm interested to see what the A7R4A does as well. I wish we could upgrade the back of the A1. I don't know if that's possible. Maybe it'll be an A1A or something down the road. But right now, I'm very happy with what I've got. In fact, I'm ecstatic with the cameras that I have now. So much so that I sent off my A9 II. Today it was sold, and I will be picking up the FX-3 for the season. So it's really exciting. So those are the two topics that I wanted to cover before we go into this portrait topic. And Corey is a member of the community, and he sent me a note after I posted earlier this week. And he's got a dear friend who's ill, and he has been asked to photograph them. And he's a little bit unsure because he is not a portrait photographer like I am or other folks might be. He's a landscape and a wildlife photographer. So for him, it's probably a very, very different skill set to do that. And I totally get that because portraiture is different than documentary work and different than landscape work because often you have to interact with people in a way that you may not be comfortable with. One of the best things about the newspaper job was it forced me to interact with people 3 or 4 times a day, sometimes more, and that kind of pulls you out of your shell. because it's very easy to sometimes just hang back and just watch. But when you're doing a portrait, you almost have to wear the director's cap. It's like when I do a wedding and I do the group photos or I do the bride and groom photos. In that 30-minute, 45-minute window, I have to be a little bit like Spielberg in a way, in that I have to direct the clients in a way that makes them feel comfortable and relaxed and allows them to give me photos that are really going to be great for them. So when it comes to portraits, I really encourage folks to use a full frame camera if possible. I'm big on full frame. Not to say you have to use it. I mean, you could make great portraits with an A6600, but I just love the framing. The quality of the sensors on the full frame cameras is top of the line for Sony. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why I like it. But part of it too is the way I see, and I see the world with a full frame kind of vision. So 35, 50, 55, or 85, or 135 are kind of my standard framing guides for just about everything, whether it's landscape, portraits, detail photos at weddings, group photos, name it. I see the world through those kind of frame lines. And so I encourage Corey, when he's making those photographs, to think about framing and think about the 50 millimeter and above primarily for portraits. If it's a portrait of 4 or 5 people, that means you have to think about depth of field. So that means you have to think about, well, what aperture is going to be the one that stops, or not stops, but gives me enough detail from foreground to background or middle ground to make sure everybody's sharp. And that might be f5, f4.5, f5.6. It may be deeper if you have a longer lens. If you're trying to shoot a group with a 135, you might need f11 in order to make sure that everybody's eyes are sharp. But say you're in the 24 to 70 range, around 50 millimeters. You probably want to work around f4.5, f5. So what shutter speed should you pick? The shutter speed that you might want to pick is probably going to be a 2/50th or above to make sure that you don't have any blurs or if you have active children, you may have to go up to 1,000. So it really depends on the activity level of the people in your photograph. So say you're at f5, 1/500th of a second. So that means ISO comes along for the ride. That means that you pick those shutter aperture combinations and your ISO will rise or fall to give you those values. So it's kind of a different way to think about it. The other thing you have to think about is where and when do you photograph somebody? Time of day is critical. Early and late, just like when you shoot landscape, is really important. The light is warmer, the shadows are longer, and it's National Geographic light, as we used to call it, those early morning hours and those late afternoon hours before sunset and just after sunset. Those are the prime times to shoot. And so even though you shoot landscapes, those same skills you look for when you try to find great color in the landscape and great light with shadow and definition would also apply to your portraits. Sometimes you don't have a choice though. And then you might be helped by lighting. But lighting can sometimes throw you off because lighting is one of those things that you're trying to think about, oh my gosh, exposure. I need to think about expression. And now you've got me to think about lighting. Well, maybe that's something to add a little bit later. But in the meantime, think about something like a 5-in-1 reflector because you've got white to reflect bright sun. You've got silver to reflect really kind of muted overcast, maybe top light. And you've got a diffusion to basically cut the light if it's sunny. So you would put that between the sun and your subjects, and that can be really great. The only downside to a 5-in-1 reflector, though, is you often need to have somebody to help you. And that may or may not happen. It may be something you could bring an assistant along to help you with this. And if you don't have an assistant, you might be able to put those reflectors on a stand with sandbags, although from experience, especially if it's windy, and here in the Midwest, the summers can be awfully windy, or at the beach or wherever you're going to do this shoot, it can be really windy spring winds. It may be trickier to do that. So that's why I've gone to using flash. And whether it's a 200 watt second flash like a Godox AD200 or an AD400 Pro with a modifier, I find that flash really helps me because I can control the light no matter the time of day. But if you're not going to be doing that, think about open shade, think about late afternoon light, think about backlighting them in late afternoon and maybe using some fill close to you with a little reflector maybe leaning up against you. You could get one with a handle that might make it easier to hold it with a kind of a short lens. It might be tricky with a long lens like a 70 to 200. But if you don't have an assistant, that might be a workaround. I've even stooped to something as kind of weird as having a white shirt to act as a reflector in those situations. And believe it or not, it does kick in a little bit of light. So don't discount that as a way to kind of help you when you're in those situations. The other thing to consider is background distance. Well, not only background distance, but to what's in your background. Is it interesting? How's it going to look at f5 with a 50 millimeter lens? How's it going to look at f5 with an 85? Is it going to be too much? Too much blur? Is it going to be too overpowering? Is it too bright? Is it going to be too dark? And how far away should your subject be from that? And so that's one of those things that's, you kind of have to season it to taste. But with a 50 millimeter lens or an 85 millimeter lens, maybe 12 feet in front of your background is a good distance, but maybe more. If you use a 135, that same 12 feet is going to look very different than it's going to look with a 50 millimeter lens. The 50 is really nice because what it does is it allows you a little bit of context. With the full frame sensor at say f5, you're going to have your subject sharp, but your background is going to start to go a little bit out of focus. It won't be quite the same as you'd get at f1.8 or f2, but remember when you're trying to photograph multiple people at 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, or even f2, you are in the Hail Mary range of focus. It's really dicey. That works fine with one person, maybe two, but when you've got a small group or a family, you've got to think about it, a little deeper aperture, f4 to f5.6, perhaps even more, to get that sharpness of everybody in the photo. And so that's something that you consider. If you use two lenses, consider the 24 to 70 and maybe a 135 or a 100 or a 90 macro or something like that. And one of the things that I find helps with the zoom is if I set the focal length by looking at it, because it's very easy to just kind of zoom and be kind of unconscious about it and kind of be a little bit sloppy. I know with the 16 to 35, for me, it's very easy to have that lens kind of just zoom on over to 16 millimeters. And I'm not very good at that wide of a lens. You've got to be really close to your subjects and you still might get distortion. So I prefer that lens at 35 millimeters. A 24 to 70, I would think about 50 millimeters as a starting point and then going longer, or using a 135 if it's a couple portrait or a headshot or even a group photo, but give it enough aperture, pick a deep enough aperture to make sure that everybody is in that group and try to maintain the plane of focus, because that's really important when you're shooting a telephoto portrait of a family. The other thing is to just have a good time and relax. And I know it sounds kind of trite and cliche to do that, but if you have a good time, if you get excited about the photos you're seeing through the lens and share that with people, it helps them feel comfortable. People who I photograph typically aren't models. They typically aren't actors. They're really not they're not people who are used to it. A wedding's a different thing because people are kind of focused on the day's events, and of course they're a little bit self-conscious at first, but then later on they don't even think about you because they're so in the moment. But a portrait is just you and your subjects, and so therefore you really have to think about how to make them feel comfortable, and it starts at confidence on your level. And it may mean that you're going to have to work through this. You are going to make mistakes when you make these photos for the first time, and many times. You'll still be making mistakes and you'll still be learning. The plateaus, I find, are short in the learning stages, but longer as you get more experienced. But those plateaus still happen. And you'll be excited because you're going to be learning so much so fast. And hopefully that will come through in what you do. Let people know that you're a little bit nervous about it, that you're a little bit unsure of it. And you'll be surprised at how willing they are to give you some, give you some grace, I guess. One of the other things too that a photographer, David Williams, said to me is, people don't need to be coached into how to be comfortable. They just know how to do it. And I've always remembered that. And I think that what David said was so true, is that people can find what's comfortable for them. And it really helps to start with a couple, mom and dad, and get them comfortable. Have them kind of lean at a slight angle, and then tell them, just find a position that feels comfortable and natural for you. Then build in the family members around them. And you'll have to maybe play with positioning based on height. And my goal is to always have a family touch in some way, but something that doesn't feel like cheesy or corny or posed or anything like that. Sometimes it really helps to have somebody just hold an arm, but I really want it to feel authentic and natural. And so I ask people, is this a way you might pose, whether they might do something with their hands or something like that, but also just look through your viewfinder. Really be critical when you analyze it and see, well, they just kind of look uncomfortable. People will give you those signals with their face and their body, and just kind of encourage them to just find a level of comfort and take a deep breath and just relax. And it works well for you too to do that too, and just be in that moment and be okay with the fact that it might be a little bit uncomfortable. You'll get more and more comfortable as time goes on. I know it seems kind of Pollyannish, but it does get easier, it does get better, and you begin to develop a kind of a ritual and a routine, not in a bad way, but you know how people best look. What lenses make people look really great? Where does the light have to be to get those repeatable and consistently great portraits of people? You should be able to do that as a professional. You should be able to go into any situation and make consistently excellent portraits and deliver the goods. That was the charter in newspapers, was we had to do that. And that's why I think it's the best training that's ever come along, because you did so many different things. Portraits was one of those things that we had to do. And sometimes we had to do them so fast that you really had to kind of work on your game to develop a plan. It's like, okay, I've got 5 minutes with this CEO. I'm going to go to the location 30 minutes ahead. I'm going to scout it. I'm going to have 2 locations or 3 locations in mind, and I'm going to go from one to the next, and I have this set up in mind. I'm going to use this lens. I'm going to use this lighting, and I'm going to go from one to the next so that they can be done in 5 to 10 minutes, because often that's all they'll give you, and sometimes even less. But when you're doing a family portrait session, it's a different story. People are much more willing to allow you to spend the time with them, because you are creating something for them that has great value. This is something that will be on their walls for generations and passed along to their kids. So in some ways, as much as I love the work that I did in journalism, and I thought it was really important in some of the stories, actually the work that I do for weddings and portrait clients is maybe even more important, because these are the kind of photos that will be passed on to family members. They will be preserved. And that's a really powerful thing. And it also gives kind of that a sense of importance, I think, to portraits that often was missing, at least from me. I know a lot of photographers, but I know from my own case, we kind of look down our nose at portrait photographers and wedding photographers. And now I've become one, so it's kind of like the joke is on me, I guess. But it's really important to value the work that we do, and your clients will really value it as well. So, Corey, I hope that helps you. If you have any follow-up questions, please be sure to send them to me via email, and then I will post them on the Stills and Films training page on Facebook. And I'm going to go back and check and see if there might be any questions. But before I do that, I want to kind of show a lens on the B cam. So this is an 85, and it's an 85-1.8, and it is one heck of a portrait lens. And for the cost of about $600, you've got an incredible incredible lens that can do a great job. It's not quite as sharp as the 135-1.8. There's very few lenses that are, but this lens is a really great step into portrait photography, as well as the 55-1.8, which is one of the two lenses that I've had since I started shooting Sony back in 2014. So I still have my 35-2.8 and the 55-1.8. And even though I'm getting the 50-1.2 G Master, I will keep that 55-1.8 because it is a great lens, especially if you don't want to carry a lot of weight. It's tiny. And it's also very light, and it's very inconspicuous. So if you are looking to have a really light pared down lens for portraits to go on travel on location, check out that 55-1.8, and then that 85-1.8 is also quite good. So thank you guys so much for being here. It's been great to do a live again. I've missed it, and it was nice to have that kind of nervous energy about doing a live stream. And I hope you found this helpful. If you have any ideas, please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would, please subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great night, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.